Stuart Nash.
Mr Speaker, as has been mentioned, Labor will support this to Select Committee. The reason we will support the Select Committee, Mr Speaker, is because we think it's very important that every New Zealander has the right to present a submission in front of parliamentarians, because this is the way that good law is made. Now, we just heard an incredible speech from Amy Adams, because she said that if it comes to victims' rights versus offenders' rights, then it's victims' rights the whole time. Well, my personal view is we must protect the rights of every New Zealander. Of course, victims' rights are paramount, and this is why this bill is in front of the House, and it's why we are supporting it. Having said that, the rights of every New Zealander, no matter where they are, who they are, what they are very, very important. And for me, well, I think for most New Zealanders, we can't say that one person's rights are more important than another person's rights. As Amy Adams, who is actually a lawyer, said that one group of people's rights are more important over another group of people's rights. And personally, I find that quite offensive, Mr Speaker, because for me, the rights of every single New Zealander are important. But, Mr Speaker, what we are talking about here, when we are talking about victims' rights, we're talking about a piece of law, I suppose, or a crime where I think it becomes very, very emotional. And that's why we end up with groups like the Sensible Sentencing Trust. We all want sensible sentencing. Of that, there is no doubt. But I don't think there are many people who say that we should be locking people up and throwing away the keys and letting them rot. I think most people agree that incarceration should also be about rehabilitation, so people can come out and become productive members of society. As mentioned, Mr Speaker, the rights of every New Zealander are most important, and it's interesting that it took until 2002 for a victims' rights bill to actually be introduced by the Labor government, of course. And actually, Ms Adams may be interested in knowing that under the Labor government, the Justice and Electoral Select Committee conducted an inquiry into victims' rights in 2007, which highlighted some of the issues that have finally been addressed by this bill. And I would suggest to Mrs Adams that if she was so passionate about victims' rights, then perhaps it shouldn't have been left till the final week of the final year of this term in Parliament for her to get passionate about that. Perhaps Mrs Adams should have been passionate about that in the first week of the first year. But it is good to see passion of that, there is no doubt. And of course, everyone in this House stands up for those who are victims of crimes. As the old saying goes, there is no such thing as a victimless crime. And while we are hard on crime because the people of New Zealand demand we are hard on crime, we also must create a society and a system which makes it very easy for victims to access absolutely everything that is possibly available to help them through what is often a very traumatic time. Not only, Mr Speaker, not only having been a victim of crime, but also then having to relive this through the whole court process, which I bet can be actually quite traumatic for a lot of people. Mr Speaker, there's something called New Zealand Crime and Safety Survey, and it estimated the level of unreported and reported crime experienced by New Zealanders over the age of 15. This was undertaken in 2008. And some of the key findings are interesting. 36% of people experience some form of victimisation. Assaults made up 27% of all offences, and threats just over 21%. 33% of all offences were reported to the police. Reporting rates varied by type, and 6% of victims experienced 54% of victimisations. Now, the thing here, Mr Speaker, I suppose that is rather damning, 33% of all offences were reported to the police. So that says about 67% of offences actually weren't reported to police. Now, there may be a number of reasons for this, but one thing we must make absolutely certain is that if people are reporting crimes to the police, if victims are reporting crimes to the police, then what we need to do, as mentioned, is make it very, very easy for that victim to access everything that's available and to work through the court system. Now, Mr Speaker, the Victims' Rights Act in 2002, that Act actually outlined the principles that guide the treatment of victims. The provisions of the Act are consistent with the current criminal justice system, laws and processes, and of course New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. Now, under this Act, victims are to be provided with certain information about the services they are eligible for and about the progress of their case through the courts. Victims are also able to provide the courts with information on the impact of the offences on them. And we see a lot of this, Mr Speaker, and often this provides a dramatic footage we see on television about cases where usually the families of victims speak out and outline to the court, to the people, and also to the perpetrator of that crime what damage this has done. What damage this has done not only to the victim but to the victim's family, friends and society in general. However, in regards to victims of certain interpersonal offences, the Act also ensures that victims are entitled to receive notification of certain events, particularly custody and parole matters relating to the accused or offender. And as mentioned, isn't it interesting that it took until 2002 under Labor to actually get a Victims' Rights Act? However, what needed to happen, and the reason for this bill, is there was a need to improve the role of victims in the criminal justice system. For the purposes of the review that was undertaken by the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry identified the problems and issues and potential solutions using information from a wide range of sources. And so this bill is actually a consequence of a lot of consultation within the community and right across the country. And the aim of this bill is to improve government agencies' responsiveness and accountability to victims of crime and to assure victims of crime, or enhance victims of crime's rights and role in the criminal justice process. And what this will do is increase victims' engagement in the court process, ensure some court processes have more directly addressed the needs of victims, enable victims to be better informed about the progress of the offender's sentence, and ensure that those agencies that provide services to victims are more accountable to victims for the delivery of those services. Now, the Law Society has expressed reservations about some of the initiatives presented by the government in this bill, particularly expanding the role of victims in the courtroom, which might move the courts away from a dispassionate dispensing of justice. And this is one of the reasons why the Select Committee process, well, we'll be watching the Select Committee process very clearly, Mr Speaker, because we are interested to see what the Law Society and other organisations involved in justice delivery have to say about this. We will pay very close attention to submissions in the Select Committee to ensure that both victims' rights and the rights of the accused are balanced to achieve an appropriate and a fair outcome, Mr Speaker, because as is the fundamental principle of our legal system, you are innocent until you are proven guilty. And so everyone, Mr Speaker, everyone must have a fair trial. However, the Law Society does support the moves in the legislation to give adult victims the right to read their statements in court. But subjecting children, as Carol Beaumont mentioned, subjecting children to further court processes might not be particularly positive advancement of children's rights, and furthermore, the use of pictures can be misleading. The Ministry of Justice, as mentioned, has identified three broad concerns facing victims of crime. Victims find it frustrating dealing with multiple agencies, and I can imagine that. I mean, taxpayers find it sometimes frustrating dealing with multiple agencies, but when you're going through having to relive this trauma again and again, it can be not only frustrating, it can be damning and it can be degrading, etc. The mechanisms for making criminal justice agencies accountable for the information they provide or the services they deliver to victims are weak. And as has been mentioned, we often talk about the perpetrators of these crimes and we often forget about the victims. And often, Mr Speaker, the victims aren't only the person that has had the crime perpetrated on them. Often it is the children, the family, or the wider community, friends, etc. So the victims of crimes can be wide and varied. Many victims find the current criminal justice processes bewildering and feel that they do not have a role in the criminal case involving them. That's about all I've got to say on this bill, Mr Speaker, but as mentioned, we will be supporting it to Select Committee and we look forward to hearing...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired. Called Conwell Judge Bucks.